Welcome, everybody, to today's fiscal year 26 Brownfield MAC application webinar, tips from TAB programs. Today's webinar is being brought to you by the Technical Assistance to Brownfields Community Providers. For those that may not know, TAB is a nationally funded program through the US EPA, and there are currently 6 TAB providers to provide assistance all across the U.S., and you will get to hear from a representative from each of the TABs in today's event. Here's just a brief overview of the topics we will be covering today. My name is Maggie Bellinger. I am the Senior Director for the TAB program at Kansas State University, and I am joined today by my fellow TABers, Randy Mendez from University of Connecticut TAB, who serves communities in EPA's Region 1. Kaylin Bruno from New Jersey Institute of Technology, or NJIT TAB, serving communities in EPA's Regions 2 and 4. We have Carrie Staten with Mid-Atlantic TAB out of West Virginia University, supporting communities in EPA Region 3. Devin Rainwater with the Center for Creative Land Recycling, or CCLR TAB, supporting communities in Regions 9 and 10. And my colleague, Kate Lucas, with K-State TAB, we support communities in EPA's Regions 5, 6, 7, and 8. Before we take a deep dive into the content, just a few reminders for being here on Zoom with us. If you experience any technical difficulties with your connection, feel free to give us a call at 785-200-7005, or you can send an email to chsr@ksu.edu, and we will try to, get you reconnected or troubleshoot any of those issues you are experiencing. If you lose connection and you can't log back on, no worries. The presentation is being recorded and will be available on the event webpage in the next couple days. Hopefully we're all pretty familiar with Zoom these days, but just a few reminders. Every participant or attendee is muted, and so we just ask that you keep your mute on, just so it helps with background noise, things like that. We also have videos turned off to help with bandwidth. If you would like to change your participant name because maybe you logged in and it's not appearing the way that you want it, you can use the participant tab that's at the bottom to click that and change your name. We will also be using the chat feature of Zoom for the Q&A portion. So if you have any questions that you would like to pose to the group, go ahead and open that chat window up and make sure that you put questions to everybody, and we will do our best to answer all the questions that you have. We hope you stick around with us for the long haul. At the end of the event, we are going to want to hear what you think and really appreciate any feedback that you're able to provide on content or how we did today. We'll take it all. So if for some reason you do have to leave early, I just wanted to throw this up here so you know there will be an opportunity to provide feedback on today's event. All right, so first things first, getting started with your MAC grant application. First and foremost, I think the most important tip that we can give is read the guidelines. There is absolutely no substitution for reading the Notice of Funding Opportunity in its entirety. You definitely want to have a good understanding of the type of grant and the funding you will be going after, as well as what entities are eligible to apply for different types of grant. Some other reminders, you need to make sure that your organization has an active account in SAMS.gov. And you can go to SAMS.gov and check on that status. You also want to ensure that you are an eligible entity. In Section 2 of the NOFOs for each type of grant, it provides a list of those entities that are eligible to apply. It does vary from grant to grant, so just make sure that whatever type of funding that you are seeking, you are eligible to apply for those funds. If you have any questions whatsoever about your eligibility as an entity or a project or a site, reach out to your EPA contacts listed in Section 1E of each NOFO. They can talk to you and answer any threshold criteria questions that you may have. Some things to keep in mind as you are evaluating threshold and addressing that criteria. Here are it's a list of some common pitfalls that we've seen in the last few competition cycles. Just missing information. Again, depending on the type of grant you're applying for, there could be anywhere from 4 to up to 15 questions of just threshold. So make sure that you are addressing each and every one of those criteria. Make sure you're an eligible entity for the type of funding being sought. Make sure that you have a unique entity identifier number at the time that you submit your application. This kind of also ties back into the earlier point of making sure that your SAMS.gov account is active and current. There's many drawdown requirements for a lot of the grants being sought if you are an existing cooperative agreement recipient. So you want to make sure that you're meeting those drawdown requirements. And you need to make sure that you have that state or tribal environmental authority letter attached to your threshold criteria. If you are coming in for a cleanup grant, some additional considerations that you want to make sure that you've addressed sufficiently is making sure that you're an eligible entity, that you have done your environmental due diligence, and that you are a bona fide prospective purchaser with that liability protection. Sometimes that gets missed and it'll kick a grant out of the review process. You must own you must own a site or all the sites that you are wanting to use cleanup grant dollars for. This is also applicable if you are applying for a multi-purpose grant. You need to at least own the site that you will be doing cleanup work on. Another commonly missed component of cleanup threshold is making sure that you meet all the requirements of the community notification and public meeting. A community notification ad must be published 14 calendar days before you submit your application. That is not 14 days before the deadline. That is before you submit your application. So if you're a go-getter and you intend to submit your application on January 20th, you need to make sure that that community notification ad is published 14 days prior to the 20th. That community notification ad needs to clearly state where folks can see a copy of the draft application and draft APCA for them to review, how they can provide feedback and comments on the 2 draft documents, and the date, time, and location of the public meeting. Again, you will need to provide documentation as part of your threshold criteria, so make sure that you account for all that information. You also will have to provide documentation of the public meeting that was held, as well as any comments that were received. Make sure that you're coordinating with your state offices now, your state and tribal environmental authorities, to get that site characterization letter, which again is a requirement for anyone applying for a cleanup grant. Each section of the grant does have a submission checklist. I have an example of the cleanup checklist there, kind of on the right-hand side of your screen. I strongly encourage you to visit the website and pull up the checklist that's applicable for the grant that you will be applying for, and just make sure that you can check off every single one of those boxes. If you fail threshold or you are missing some information, your application will not be reviewed and then therefore not considered for funding. So understanding threshold and passing it is very, very important for these applications. All right. And with that, we're going to take our deep dive right in and hear from all of our tab experts about various components of the grant application. Up first, I have a question for Randy with UCONN. If you are a community or an entity trying to evaluate what type of funding to seek, how can you determine which grant is right for you?
Awesome. Thanks, Maggie. As a quick before I jump in, I saw there's a couple questions in the chat. Do we want to answer those before we begin, or
Go for it.
So it looks like the first one is where can one find the NOFO? So if you go to if you just Google EPA Brownfield grants, you could do that. Or if you, I think we might have provided a link earlier. If not, we can provide it in the chat again. But within that, um, you'll go to basically the current or I think it's current funding opportunities is what it's linked as on EPA's website. And under that, it'll list cleanup, multi-purpose, and assessment. And then there's three different assessment types of grants. So then when you click the one that you're hoping to apply for, you should be able to, I guess it navigates you to another page. I know it's a lot of different navigation, so I apologize, but it navigates you to another page where you can get the NOFO from there.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks. And then I don't know if anyone else wanted to jump in to answer some of these other ones, or if you want me to just quickly tackle them before I get started, or if we're answering them in the chat already.
Yeah, Randy, I can take lead on answering things in the chat, but a lot of them are maybe a little straightforward, but if there are ones that I think we should spend a little more time on, we can plan to do that.
Okay.
Perfect. Thank you. Okay, so next slide then after all, Maggie. So there's a couple different factors when it comes to deciding, whether or not to apply for a Brownfield grant and then what type of grant you should apply for. Some of these are listed in this slide, but they kind of come down to eligibility. Do you know your target sites? Do you know what's happened on them? Have they been assessed at all? Are they ready for cleanup? And then do they meet the threshold criteria? The threshold criteria is a little bit different for each type of grant, and that's something that the NOFO goes into, and it's something that you'll have to respond to. I'm not going to go into a ton of detail within that, but these are some of the basic questions that you want to start thinking about when it comes to applying for grants. Go ahead. So this year we have the multi-purpose grant, assessment grants, and cleanup grants. Every other year we also have the RLF. This year will not be an RLF year, but within the assessment grant we have community-wide assessment grants, assessment coalition grants, and then community-wide grants for states and tribes. And I'll explain a couple of the nuances between those in the next few slides. So for multi-purpose, the things that you want to know, I tried to pull out some of the key factors of what would make sense to you as a community or a regional entity, et cetera, who would be thinking about applying for these grants as things that you need to have ready now, basically. So with multi-purpose, you want to have one discrete area with one or more brownfield sites. This would be something or a grant that you would want to apply for if you have some assessment needs and some cleanup needs. In addition, funding for this can be used for looking at feasible reuse plans, and then applicants can apply for up to 1 million. We've been hearing from all the EPA webinars that they highly recommend you apply for the full $1 million, and there's approximately 20 of these awarded across the nation. For community-wide assessment grants, so this is a really good grant if you're just getting started in the brownfields world. You can either be in a municipality applying for this or a regional entity, a nonprofit, et cetera. Check just the eligibility criteria. But basically, if you have an idea of some brownfield sites in your community or the region that you serve, this could be a really great starting point for you before you dive into some of the more complex grants. Typically, we recommend at least 3 sites to be identified within your target area or geographic boundary, but there is no actual site requirement for the grant. This grant is $500,000 and approximately 70 are awarded across the nation. For the coalition grant, this is a type of grant where you basically create some partners. So the jargon behind it is the lead and non-leads. The main applicant is the lead, and then you partner with 2 to 4 non-leads that are essentially identified based on their inability to kind of tackle these grants on their own. Ideally, these coalition partners allow you to have capacity increased and allow you to identify other geographical boundaries that you want to partake the brownfield activities on. Some of the nuances within this coalition assessment grant is that there's eligibility criteria for who the non-leads are. One of the non-leads cannot have received a MARC grant prior. So you want to make sure when you're identifying your coalition partners that that is one of those things that you keep in mind. The non-leads cannot be affiliated with another non-lead. So you can't have 2 people from the same city representing the city. you also have to have discretely different geographic boundaries that do not overlap. Um, you need to be able to identify and put assessment funds towards at least 2 sites within each of those geographic boundaries represented by your non-leads. So it's also important that you have a concept of how many brownfields are in each area and that you have at least 2 that would be eligible for assessment funds. Within this grant, applicants can request up to 1.5 million and approximately 39 are going to be awarded across the nation. And then last but not least, for the assessment grants, we have the state and tribes. So this is only available to states and federally recognized tribal nations. The awards are funded under the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. At least 5 sites must be identified within the narrative, but a minimum of 10 must be assessed over the span of time that you have the grant. Within that, you are eligible to apply for $2 million, and there's going to be about 18 awarded nationally. And then finally, we have the cleanup. This is fairly straightforward in the sense that this grant is utilized for funding cleanup activities on a brownfield site. The nuances behind this, though, is that you have to be the owner of the site. You cannot be responsible for the contamination, and the site must have sufficient characterization in order to receive the cleanup grant. So within this, an ABCA must be completed in order to apply for this grant. Typically a phase 2 also completed. There is wiggle room for additional assessment to be completed, but you have to explain where the funds are coming to do that. For this, you can apply for either up to $500,000, of which 10 awards will be awarded across the nation, or you can apply for the secondary threshold, which is above $500,000 to $4 million, and roughly 26 of those will be awarded nationally.
Okay, great, thank you. Did anybody else have anything they want to tag on to, any tips or advice for deciding on a grant? Okay.
I'll just add quickly, if you're not sure which one you want, talk to your tab provider. We're happy to help talk through all the pros and cons of each solution and help guide you towards our, our best.
Great, thanks, Kate.
I think it's also worth noting that the community-wide assessment grant tends to be the most popular one. I think the numbers show that 230 applications for that grant type were submitted last year, and there was less. The success rate was around 40%. And a lot of the applicants, the margin was only like 4 or 5 points. So those are all these grants are very competitive, I think, but it's just worth noting that the community-wide assessment is really popular. So you have to have a tight application for that one in particular.
Great. Thank you. Okay, well, Kaylin, my next question is for you.
Sure.
Where can a community or an applicant look for data, and how is some best ways to incorporate that data into a competitive narrative?
Yeah, so, obviously the point of this whole exercise is that you're asking for a lot of money. So you do need to establish that the community really needs it, and that your project is worthy of this really competitive grant funding. Overall, I think in terms of bringing in data, we're really talking about criterion 2. And this is where, in order to establish that you really need this money, the EPA is asking you to tell a cohesive data story about why your community really needs it, why this money needs to come from the outside, why you need this outside source of funding, why your project is worthy of this in the competitive environment. And so typically when we're looking at these data sources, they come from all over. So we're incorporating census data, demographic, environmental information, data related to contaminant exposure, climate hazards, even like health data as well, information on welfare of residents and populations, diseases of despair, and so on. So I think, and the other tabs can weigh in on this. The common mistake that I think we really see when reviewing the grant applications is that people just throw all of that data into criterion 2, like throw everything in the kitchen sink. And without looping it back to why it's relevant to the project and why it's relevant to brownfields in general. Another mistake I think is that not showing data that's representative of your target area. So if you're showing state level data, that's not really highlighting how that relates to your specific community. So I think like the best piece of advice actually comes from the EPA's FAQ document, which, if you're not familiar with it, is just like a wealth of information. But on this topic, they say applicants should select the type of demographic information to support their responses based on their assessment of what information will make the best case that their community needs Brownfields grant funding. And also keeping in mind that the reviewer is not going to be familiar with your community. So you can really use criterion 2 as an opportunity to tell the reviewer or the reader about your community and really illustrate those challenges. So in preparation for this session today, I really took a look at successful grants, specifically the grants that were scored the highest from the last competition, and going through and looking at criterion 2 specifically, I noticed some commonalities between all of them. First of all, that they were concise. They maybe had like a paragraph with some of this information, a few sentences to like a paragraph, and that was it. And the paragraph, the text that they use really anchor their responses to brownfields and site reuse, tying it back to the community as well. Like, what does it mean to the community to be experiencing those burdens that you're presenting data on? And again, tying it back to brownfields, how do unaddressed, unsecured, unassessed brownfield sites in the community tie back to that data that you're presenting? And I noticed too that they're choosy about the data that they're incorporating into their grant application. So I also came up with some tips, and I really recommend that if you're struggling with this topic, doing what I did and looking at past successful grant applications, see how they formatted it, just, look at it for inspiration. My second tip is to take a look at the data sources, but pick the ones that really resonate and tell your story the best. And those are the ones that are going to tie back to your site reuse or your brownfields specifically. So there's 2 data sources that I think are really helpful in this regard. The first, so in the previous competitions, we had access to really helpful map platforms like CGEST or EJ Screen. Those are no longer available. The CDC has a similar type of map application that has been restored. That's called the EJI Explorer. It's through their Place Health initiative, and I will I just mentioned a couple things. I'll drop these in the chat once I'm done getting my thoughts out, I guess. But that's really helpful because it has tract level information on environmental burdens, social vulnerabilities, climate risks, things like that. I wouldn't mention the EJ index or any of that's not going to really be relevant to this year's competition, but the underlying data that they pull in a really usable format, I think is will really be helpful. And there's also a utility in that tool where you can click it says develop a county report, and then it easily compares your data to county, state, and national level data, which is another thing that you're going to have to establish to show the need. And my second favorite is the CDC's Places Comparison Report. This has a lot of data on health, behavior, things like rates of disabilities, other factors like dental health, depression rates, drug and alcohol abuse. That could be really helpful in putting together your grant application. And again, that compares it for you to different areas. And then my last tip is to use data sources that have a high, I'm calling it like a high geographic resolution, I guess. So like census tract or smaller. So you want to make this data really relevant to your target area. And yeah, I'm curious what the other tabbers have to say about that, and if that's also kind of a similar common mistake that you see, that people just throw too much data into this section.
Yeah, I think those are all really good tips. The things that I would add would be that there are some states that have EJ screen similar resources that are still available that may have really good data. So in Region 3, I know for sure Pennsylvania, as an example, has a really good resource. Virginia, I believe, has one as well. So that may be a place that you can get some of this information as well. And then I would say in rural communities, it can be really hard to get way down to the census tract or neighborhood level. That's something that tabs can try to help you with. And if at the end of the day you just can't find it, you should say that. Say, we are a town of 500 people and there is not data available for our level. And that is a further demonstration of a disadvantage, right? Of being impacted in ways that other places are not. But you don't ignore it. Acknowledge it so it doesn't look like you just didn't answer that part. So I think that those were the two things that kind of popped up for me while you were talking.
I would also add that I see that too. Avoid as much as possible just throwing all the data into a table. You don't want the reader to have to interpret what it all means. And then also try to explain how it relates to like state or national levels. So don't just say I have this percentage because there's no context of what that actually means in the grander scheme of things.
Thank you. We had a few questions in the chat. Somebody asked if the data sources referenced can be put in the chat. I do think we are putting most or all of them in there. Also, at the end of this webinar, we're going to provide like a fact sheet that'll be uploaded to the event webpage as a resource for all of these links that we've been sharing and providing. So you can check back there. And there are a couple other questions that I think we can keep going with the chat. So until then, next question belongs to Ms. Carey. How can grant applicants handle administrative costs in their budget? And do you have any other overall budget tips to share?
So I think one thing I noticed that really stood out to me, Nerdy Budget Girl, in the guidelines this year was the way that their sample budget table from EPA, which you don't have to use, but that's what they're going to be used to seeing, so it doesn't hurt to use it, specifically pulls out administrative tasks. And I think it can be confusing, frankly, the way the EPA explains administrative task and what is a direct administrative task and an indirect administrative task. And so one thing that I have found really useful literally this morning is diving into those FAQs that we talked about before. They do a good job, a better job in that document than the guidelines themselves of really diving into what is an administrative task, what's an example of a direct administrative task. The other thing I think that's really great about an EPA grant versus many other grants that I interact with is that they do have a broader understanding of what's a programmatic cost than other grants. So things like managing your grant, they consider a programmatic cost and not administrative. So a lot of the stuff that others might think of as overhead, EPA is going to say is programmatic if it's directly tied to your grant. So things that cannot be tied directly to your grant are going to be what are known as indirect administrative costs. That's like your typical overhead, and that's where you're just going to put it in your indirect line item. But there are some parts of revising your scope, revising your work plan moving forward that you would want to call out of that direct administrative task. And again, you're going to hear us say this the whole time. Your tab provider can help you navigate some of that. But I'll tell you, if you call Region 3, I'm going to be looking at those FAQs and working through it with you. So starting there is a really good place to start. Otherwise, more broadly on budget, I think being really clear in your cost estimates of how you got your numbers is crucial. I see people get hung up on this all the time where they just throw in the numbers and they don't break it down, especially when it comes to like your cleanup plan on a cleanup grant, breaking it down, show your work, show your math. That's really helpful, for sure. The other thing I would say is use an Excel sheet before you plop it in that table and do all your figuring somewhere where something else can do the math for you, and then put your final version in the Word document so that you make sure that all the math checks, because they are looking. They're going to make sure that the math all totals up in the table. They're going to make sure all the math in the narrative part totals up and that everything matches. And I have seen people lose grants primarily just because their numbers didn't match. So those are my kind of top level. We have a resource, a budget worksheet that can help you work through that. So I think those are the most important pieces to start for sure.
Excellent, thank you. Any other
There's
advice? Oh, go ahead.
there's a question in the chat, just clarifying, indirect costs are not supposed to go over 5%. Is that correct?
Administrative costs are not supposed to go over 5%. So that could be indirect or direct, but indirect costs are gonna, I think, probably exclusively be administrative. I can't think of an indirect cost that wouldn't be administrative, but yeah.
And as a follow-up to that, Beth asks if the 5% administrative threshold is a deal breaker.
Yes.
Yes, whether an application would be awarded. Okay. We also had a question. Oh,
Sorry, there's some language in the FAQ and maybe in the guidelines as well where they explain like your negotiated rate. So you could charge your negotiated rate up to a threshold, but you cannot, more than 5% of your total grant cannot be used for administrative costs. So whether you front load it and just charge it all until you hit that, or you just do like an indirect across the board, it's that number, 5% of the total cost cannot be, that's the deal breaker.
Then we have a question from Jessica asking if personnel costs relate to administrative costs, or how do personnel costs relate to costs?
So that's where it gets into some of that. I'm going to actually pull up the FAQs while we're talking, you guys. I think that's going to come down to some of the things that we talked about. I'm going to look at the guidelines, and I don't have the link because I've downloaded it. My cat's going to say hi. He has opinions about administrative costs. But not all personnel is going to be considered administrative cost. If it's the personnel to do the community input or community involvement of your grant, if it's the personnel to do the work of your grant, that is a direct cost that is programmatic. Reporting is considered programmatic. There are personnel costs around managing some of the part of your procurement, but not all of it, that they consider administrative costs. And again, they've got that detail in here. I'll pull some of that language and drop it in, and then I'll get that that link as well while we're talking. And others may have other thoughts. I did spend a lot of time this morning in this.
Great. Thank you, Carrie.
I just have a suggestion for building your budget and your costs. There's a tool developed by Community Lattice called ABC, which pull together all, say you aren't sure how much a phase 1 costs. So this does it by region, and it's all data from EPA, from acres. So it should be, pretty accurate to what other grant recipients in your area had spent on each of those items. So it breaks it down for average cost for phase 1, 2, and cleanup. And I'll put that link in the chat for your use.
Great, thank you.
I did want to, I guess, address the question that's in the chat about the administrative cost and just reiterate that if you do remove it, you have to mention it that you're not, that you don't have any administrative costs. They've pretty much told us don't leave anything blank in this application, especially because there could be people who are completely unaware. The if applicable, they said basically just say yes or no. Don't even not answer if it doesn't apply to you. So if you're saying you don't have administrative costs, be very clear in your writing about that.
Yeah, and I would even recommend leaving that column and showing your administrative costs as 0. It is better to be extremely clear about that sort of thing than for them to wonder if there are administrative costs that are not being shown.
Great advice, everyone. Thank you.
On a related note, within the EPA budget template, they do not want, you are not able to change budget categories. So that is the rows within that table: personnel, fringe benefits, travel, equipment, supplies, contractual, construction, other. Do not change those categories. You can change the columns, but you cannot change the budget categories, the rows.
Yeah, and that's a good point, Kate. And it reminded me of something else. That's going to make it line up with your 424, which will make it easier to fill out that federal grant. But I also noticed in this grant that in other, when they suggest things that you might categorize as other, they include conference registration as an other. So the cost to register for a conference, they would categorize as other, not travel, which is not what I would default to, and not what I've seen before. And so I would just take that suggestion, and you can include in your budget travel to a state Brownfield conference, travel to a national Brownfield conference, or other conferences that might help you with your grant. And I would encourage you to do that because those things can be really helpful. But move the registration over to other because that's what they said they like.
Thank you. Okay, Devin, what type of partnerships are good for the type of funding being sought? And do you have any advice on best practices to demonstrate community involvement within the application?
Yeah, absolutely. So I thought I would kind of start tackling this question by clarifying who partners are and where they come in and where it's strategic to include partners in your grant applications. So I've seen this confusion before. So I wanted to clarify that the majority of the environmental work that's done under your MAC grant, if you have an assessment grant doing the phase 1, phase 2 development of an APCA report, or if you have cleanup grant, conducting cleanup activities, those activities will be completed by qualified environmental professionals that you procure according to federal requirements, typically after you get the grant. That's what EPA recommends. And the partnerships that you choose to describe in your grant application when you submit it are typically organizations that do not need to go through this process. They are typically, nonprofits, community groups, or county contacts or partners or city partners that will support the additional tasks under your grant. You can also name partners as subrecipients under your grant, but those subrecipients need to be named as such in your grant and must be eligible for brownfield funding as an eligible applicant. Partners that are not identified as subrecipients and are actually described, under the community needs section. They can support with community engagement and outreach, brownfield inventory and site planning if you're doing site assessment activities. They can help with cleanup planning and also reuse visioning activities, like community engagement, which I'll talk about in a little bit too, best practices for that. But my general tip for, when you're approaching the partnership section in your grant is that have the insight, that EPA reviewers really want to see existing partnerships in place that can support the work that you're doing under your grant. So that can support, the development and success of the work that's under this grant during the grant period. So they really want to see that the work is going to get done. So the more that you can show, hey, we have partners that are going to do these tasks and describe which tasks those partners are going to do, what their specialty is, the better, and more robust that section is going to be. And there's not really explicit requirements to define the partnerships that are there, but there is of course, the requirement to show how you're going to complete this work under the grant, and also how you'll engage the community. So it's a great way to show that through partnerships. And I've also referred to the EPA FAQ for this year. It's a really great document. So I highly recommend also just like Control F search partner in the FAQs because it's really helpful. They list so many different ideas for engaging partners and identifying them. But I wanted to highlight, for example, you would need to identify partners under the community need and community engagement section 2. And 2E through 2F actually asks you to identify local organizations, entities, or groups that will assist with the project. And they recommend that you include these folks in a table, which a lot of folks often do. And you can also go through past successful grant applications to see the different types of partners that folks have listed out. But you'll be asked to identify the organization and their role in the project. And for example, in a community-wide assessment grant, you'll be asked to identify how each organization or partner will be participating in certain assessment activities like site selection and reuse planning. And so those activities that you want to identify the roles of your partners for, they're going to be different for each grant. So definitely read the guidelines or the FAQs to identify, specifically how you want to describe the role of your partners. But I really think it's great to establish a diverse group of partners so that you can show that each kind of section or task under your grant is going to be addressed with a community partner. And let's see, so I want to look at the FAQs because EPA actually describes some of the organizations that you can name as partners. So they can be community-based organizations such as non-governmental, civic, and nonprofit organizations like service clubs, veterans organizations, local universities and colleges, youth organizations. There's a ton listed here, faith-based organizations, and they can also be community liaisons to represent residents directly, or they can be property owners, local lenders even that'll assist with financing activities. And even developers that have an interest in the project, you can list them as partners. And so, as also a tip, EPA is not really looking for, a ton of partners. Like they're not going to give you a higher score if you have 20 partners versus 3 partners. They're really looking for the roles that those partners are going to perform. So the quality matters over the quantity. And these partners might, engage in anything from community engagement to financial support, including like hosting fundraising events or educational support, the distribution of information to community members and residents. And they might also even provide pro bono materials or services like a building to host your public meeting or equipment or materials related to that. And so again, overall, EPA wants to see that you have folks in the community that are already doing some work related to your project or that have skills that relate to your project that'll help you get that work done. And it's also, as I start talking about community engagement, EPA kind of wants to see if it's available, it'll be beneficial if you've already done community engagement or if your partners have already done community engagement around the work that you're going to be doing under your Brownfields grant. If you show that in your application, that can show EPA there's already a big interest from the community in doing this project. That's why you should pick us. We're already going, we've already got this. We've already got this work started. There's interest from the community. We'll have backing for this to go through. So that's, of course, not a requirement, but it's definitely beneficial if you have that. And so we already talked a little bit about the community engagement requirements for cleanup grants, but I'll just quickly go through them again. So engaging the community is important to do even before you do your application with community or with the cleanup grants. So all of your target communities that you're naming in your cleanup grant application must receive a notification of your plan to apply and also be provided an opportunity to comment on your draft application. So yes, this does mean that you need to have a draft application ready before the grant is actually due, before the deadline, because you need to share that draft with the community that's going to be affected by the application. This does not need to be a complete draft, but it needs to be a draft that folks can meaningfully comment on. And you'll also need to include your ABCA report or your analysis of brownfield cleanup alternatives as an attachment, also to be commented on by the public. And so this notice must be published at least 14 calendar days before you submit your application. And it should also include notice of a public meeting that you're going to host to discuss your application. And this public meeting just needs to happen before you submit the grant. And also, any comments that you receive on the draft application through the public notice or the public meeting should be included in your final draft of that application. Assessment grant and so assessment grant engagement requirements are less prescriptive than the cleanup requirements, but you still need to show, like I said, you need to show your partners and you need to show that you have an engagement plan, that you're ready to engage the community. So you need to show that you're going to reach out to the local community, make sure they're engaged in your project. And also, you want to be sure to show that you have plans for virtual engagement as well. So you can list out your goals for public meetings and engagement and make sure that you have a virtual plan as well. So EPA wants to see that you are going to update the community with project progress and specifically that you're going to include residents that are directly affected by your project work, so the residents that are in the target area, as well as any organizations, entities, and groups that are in that target area as well. So like I said, my final tip for community engagement is, be clear with your community engagement plan. Make sure it's addressing those in your target area. And also, if you have already heard even, whispers or anything from the community about Brownfield's work or about the work on these sites, include that in your application as well, because it's really meaningful to show interest from communities and existing partners. But yeah, that's my input. So I'll open it up to the rest of our panelists as well.
Great. Thank you, Devin. That was pretty comprehensive. Does anybody else
I'm
have
glad.
any other food for thought on partnerships and community involvement? Okay. There is a quick question. Well, I don't know if it's quick in the chat. Can the draft application undergo edits between when it's posted for public review, comment, and submission? Yes.
I guess it is quick, yes.
Right. I mean, and that's kind of the intent. Not only are you letting the community know, hey, we're applying for these funds, but it is an opportunity to get their feedback and actually incorporate then that feedback into your project. And you can then actually demonstrate that as part of your narrative that, hey, we have the backing of the community. And so, yes.
Yeah, it is a draft. So it's not, nobody expects it to be a final. I always tell people, though, it should be a good faith draft. So it shouldn't be like, here's an outline and I've left 4 questions completely empty, right? It should have a pretty solid draft, but it doesn't have to be perfect. And yeah, you can keep working on it. Don't lose those 14 days. That would be terrible.
Yeah, and they do specifically ask, if they're still collecting cost estimates for remediation and editing the budget, is that okay? And that's a little bit more, you are still doing data collection and that is totally fine. Again, it is a draft. To the best of your ability, hopefully what you have initially is not going to be doubled or tripled or whatever, with those additional cost estimates. So hopefully, you can present maybe a range within that draft, and then drill down on that a little bit more specifically once you collect a little bit more data on cost estimates. There's another question asking if the draft grant application should be all components of the application, including the threshold criteria and the narrative information sheet, or if it just needs to be the narrative.
So this application, or so yeah, what you share in your public notice should at least be the narrative with the APCA attached.
Yes. Yeah, so you don't need to include your threshold eligibility criteria or your narrative information sheet.
Okay.
But you can if you want to.
All right. Kate, what are best approaches for forming a coalition and expending grant funds under a coalition grant?
Yeah. Okay, so Randy did an overview of coalition grants, but I'm going to revisit that a little bit just to make sure everyone's on the same page. With a coalition grant, you have one lead entity. Then you have 2 to 4 non-lead entities. So in total, your coalition assessment grant is going to have no fewer than 3 and no more than 5 total members. So you can have, one lead and then 2 to 4 of the non-lead members. Typically, and ideally, the non-lead members do not have capacity to manage their own brownfield grant. Obviously, that's somewhat subjective. There's no black or white. Could they have managed their own brownfield grant absent this coalition grant? But really, you're looking for a capacity or an organization with a bit more capacity to be leading and assisting these other non-lead entities that are lower in capacity, whether that's outright because they're smaller organizations or because they're understaffed or they just don't have a brownfields project manager. All of those could be justifications for why the non-lead entities could not manage their own grant. So then within, so you have, let's say I'm going to continue to use a coalition grant with one lead entity, and then we'll say 3 non-lead entities. So in this example, we'll have a total of 4 entities who are participating in this coalition. So at the beginning of the grant, you need to define your geographic boundary. And in some situations, in most situations, probably the lead entity's geographic boundary will encompass the geographic boundaries of the non-lead members. So oftentimes you have a county leading a coalition that involves maybe communities within that county or nonprofits. And obviously the county, that's a pretty big boundary. The cities are located within that boundary. And so the geographic areas can overlap. That is basically anywhere where your work can be done. There are other situations, let's say, a lot of times coalitions are led by regional economic development or planning organizations, councils of government. In that situation, it may be a collection of counties. And in that situation, you could have counties as non-lead members. You could also have communities within those counties as non-lead members. And then those are all acceptable structures for the grant. So the geographic boundaries can overlap. Target areas, however, cannot overlap. And target areas are specific neighborhoods, corridors, census blocks, or tracts. Just general areas outlined by, a river or a highway, just looking at sections of a city where you are planning to focus your brownfields assessment efforts. Those target areas cannot overlap, and they must be in at least 3 distinct municipalities or jurisdictions. So in our example here, let's say the lead entity is a county, and the 3 non-lead members are 3 cities within that county. You have to have target areas in the county, and then within city A and city B. City C doesn't necessarily have to have a target area, but typically in that situation, if they're participating, you would see a target area associated with each of the non-lead members. Within each of those target areas, you have to have 2 sites identified that you discuss in your grant narrative that are potential sites that you want to address with this brownfield grant. You are not held to those sites. It takes about a year for these grants to be awarded, and these are often privately owned sites, and you can't control what happens with them. So you are not held to these sites, but you do need to have shown that you have thoughtfully identified a few sites, 2 sites specifically, at least within each target area that you are planning to address or tackle with this Brownfield Assessment Grant, Coalition Assessment Grant. So I kind of described a couple acceptable iterations of a coalition grant. A coalition grant that wouldn't work includes organizations from the same organization. So for example, a city government working with nonprofits that operate within that city. Okay, sorry, that's a different scenario. So you don't want to have organizations that are the same organization. So basically a city and potentially a redevelopment authority or an urban renewal authority that is an agent of that city. Those are not acceptable lead and non-lead coalition members because they are essentially the same organization. You want to have fully distinct organizations as your lead and non-lead members. You also typically do not want to have a city and then nonprofits operating within that city. You can, but typically in that scenario, it would be more suitable for a community-wide assessment grant. With the coalition grants, they're looking for projects that are going to involve a wider area and different players kind of with different focus areas in this grant application. I see there's a question in the chat asking if it's 2 priority sites within each target area or 1, and it is 2 priority sites within each target area. And then you have to have at least 3 target areas and in distinct municipalities or jurisdictions. Okay. Okay, we had a question in the chat a little bit earlier. Oh, another thing about non-lead members, you do have to have at least 1 member who has never received an EPA Brownfield grant. That can be a lead member of the coalition. Typically, it's one of those non-lead members. However, those non-lead members who have never received a Brownfield grant can have been a member of a coalition grant in the past. So as long as they're not the lead on a Brownfield grant, then they count as having never received a Brownfield grant. And then another important topic here is geographic boundaries. So you cannot include the if the applicant's geographic boundary, the lead applicant's geographic boundary does not include the geographic boundaries of non-lead members, you have to demonstrate that the lead agency has authority to expend funds within that property that is outside of the jurisdiction. So that can be something like bylaws or ordinances. But you can also, if you don't have any of those, legal documents already existing, you can talk to your legal counsel and have them draft an opinion that states that you have the authority to spend money outside of your jurisdiction. Okay, so those are kind of the logistical considerations. A few tips. I was kind of looking through coalition grant guidelines and prepping for this and was thinking back we all went to high school and we all did group projects in high school. And sometimes those group projects went well, sometimes they didn't. But typically, you want that lead coalition member to be that super organized type A, straight A student who is going to be managing everybody's business and making sure everybody's staying on task and that all the money is being spent and everybody's being an active participant. The lead member can't do all the work on their own, but they need to be the one who is willing to take the lead and actively manage this project. If you don't think that you have that type A, straight A student, or you're not the organization that has capacity to be in that role, a lead member of a coalition grant is probably not the right fit for you. There's also no benefit, there's no bonus for including more coalition members. In my opinion, it would be better to be a lead with 2 non-lead entities that are going to be active and good participants, as opposed to trying to get 4 non-lead members, 2 of whom you maybe aren't sure, if they're going to be good contributors to the project. You also want to make sure you have a good relationship with those non-lead members. I know that there can be a lot of conflict between counties and cities in certain situations. And, I would just make sure that you have a good working relationship before applying for a coalition grant. And I think that is about it. So we have a couple questions in the chat.
One question in the narrative for the two sites. Do you need to discuss both sites or just one?
So you do need to discuss both sites. A lot of times these are included as a table. And you don't have to, you don't need to go into the depth of a cleanup grant where you're saying, here's everything that's ever happened on this site. You can present a table and say, here's target area 1, and sites 1 and 2 within target area 1 are, one's a former dry cleaner, it's privately owned, and here's our proposed reuse for that site. You can present that in a fairly space efficient way.
I did want to clarify that because it's similar to
Okay.
the statewide grant where you need to assess at least 10. You don't need to mention all 10 in the narrative. You just need to mention 5. And I think the coalition's similar where you just need to mention the priority site that you're focusing on within each target area and then be ready to assess a secondary site within each target area once you receive the grant.
Yeah, in my notes, I just said 2 sites per target area. I would need to go back and double check that. Exactly what amount of information you're supposed to be including in your grant.
Another question. So in theory, a COG could be the lead agency and have 2 to 4 cities and or counties in that region being the non-lead. You would need 3 target areas in 3 different jurisdictions with 2 sites in each target area. Yes.
So just to clarify, you need 1 target area in 3 jurisdictions. So a total of at least 3 target areas in 3 separate jurisdictions.
Right.
You don't have to have 3 target areas per jurisdiction. So the minimum number of target areas would be 3, not 9 in this particular scenario, just to be clear. Yeah, and then 2 sites.
Is there a max on target areas?
There is no defined max on target areas, I don't think. But again, you have space limitations within the guidelines. We would recommend it kind of depends on just what you're dealing with, but I would say more than 2 target areas per lead or per coalition member is probably too much to describe. I would say, again, better to provide more detail on slightly quality over quantity, basically, in everything here. For both coalition members.
Final question in that one, is it beneficial to have a target area for each non-lead? It's not only beneficial, it is required.
One way to think about this. Sorry, Kate.
There's just really no point in having a non-lead member participate if there's not a target area within their jurisdiction. You are supposed to spend your grant funds primarily within those target areas, and if they don't have a target area, they don't really have claim to much money.
I was just going to throw out there when you're writing this, you want to think about, as everyone has said, you're writing a story and you have main characters. And if you have too many main characters, it gets harder for the reader to follow the storyline. You think of like Game of Thrones, for example. I remember everyone started making all those trees of characters and trying to identify what the storyline was. And it gets really confusing for everybody. So you want to think about creating the main characters that you need and then following the storyline, following those.
One final question on coalition, because I think it's an important one, and then we can move on. What if a target area crosses jurisdictions?
So ideally, that target area, both jurisdictions where that target area is located are members of the coalition. If one is a member and one is not a member, then you would need to have that legal opinion or ordinance or justification proving that you are able to spend, you can use those funds outside of your own jurisdiction.
Great. Thank you. Okay. That was really good. Thank you, everyone. Now, real quick, I am going to give a very, very quick overview of Tabby Z, which is a free online grant writing assistance tool that is available for anybody to use. It may be accessed on the website there, ksutab.org, eTools Tabby Z. It's a free online template to help kind of simplify and streamline the grant writing process for any of these EPA grants. This is a screenshot of just the landing page. You don't have to be logged in to access any of this information, but it's got some quick links to a lot of the things we've already discussed today, like the MARC grant NOFOs, the FAQs, those submission checklists that I mentioned at the beginning. There's also links to some data resources as well as example grant applications. For those that want to write in the tool, you do need to have a KSU tab account, but if you registered for this event, unless you were forwarded on the Zoom link, you already have one, so that should be pretty simple. Once you have an account, you can either log in, or if you need to register for an account, you do that Get Started Now button. Either or gets you in the same spot. You can create an account and log in. Once you have an account and you're logged in, you want to start by creating a grant application. You'll be asked for a grant name. You will be at, like, if there's any application notes. So for example, say you're applying for a coalition grant and the application notes could be, you know, applying for coalition with this entity and this other entity, just to keep track of things specific to that particular grant. You can also at this point add additional participants. So if you are working with multiple people in your organization to draft the grant, you can add them in as users, and then everybody can be working on the same template at the same time. Once you've created and decided on the grant, this is kind of the main page of Tabby Z once you log in. On the left-hand side, there is the outline that goes through each of the components of the grant and the sections. And then on the right-hand side is where you actually can read the criteria and do some typing within a text box. You can set up your grant under this configuration menu. It asks for the funding that you're going to be seeking, as well as going through some of those threshold and those commonly missed questions about, do you own a site? What is, you know, if you own a multi-purpose, or if you have a multi-purpose grant, what is your status? So the configuration, while it's not required, it is very helpful just to be a double check to make sure that you're an eligible entity and that you can meet the threshold criteria for the particular grant that you are applying for. And then again, on the left-hand side, you can maneuver each section by just clicking on that section and then typing on the right. For each section of a grant, Tabby Z includes the narrative criteria set forth by EPA. So that is in this section, describe the priority sites, describe your target area. And then it also includes the evaluation criteria, how that section is going to be scored and evaluated. Each section also includes some helpful hints, so some tips that have been generated by all the tabs of just to help you address the criteria for that section. That is in a separate drop-down menu that you can click, and then it opens up and you can see some additional advice there. If you did add multiple participants to join you in this grant writing adventure, you can manage their access by clicking on the pencil up at the top. You can add additional folks at this point. You can remove anybody that no longer needs access to your application, whatever you need for your specific proposal. By default, the owner of the grant template application doesn't have track changes on. So the editor within Tabby Z is kind of set up, as you can see, very similar to Word. It has track change features, it has comment features, and so you can keep track of and see who added what content to different sections throughout the application, and then say maybe you as the owner of that template can go in and accept those changes, reject the changes. You can also look at, revisions and see again who did what when. so everybody can be working in the same space on the same application and have all the information readily available. You want to make sure that you save frequently. You can also use those navigating forward and next arrows to move throughout the application, throughout the various sections. When you complete a section of your application, you would mark it as complete, and then it shows up as completed in the left-hand column, the navigation view. If you haven't started drafting within a particular section yet, it'll still show draft. So one of the nice things about Tab Easy is it does really help you go through each section, make sure you're addressing all the criteria, and hopefully not miss anything. Once you are finished with your application, you will need to export it to a Word, and you can do that by accessing the Export to Word feature there at the top of the navigation panel. And it's a blank formatting Word document. So you're going to want to make sure that you do all the formatting, that you're meeting the requirements, and then just do a quick glance to make sure that all the sections are included, and that, again, you've addressed each section being asked for in that particular grant application. After you've exported to Word, you can send it into your tab for a reviewer. So here's just a quick overview of the contacts for each of the tabs. And I'm going to pass it to Randy to talk first about their grant review process.
So, excuse me, my voice just cracked. For our grant review process, we do have a link on our website that you can go to and submit your grant. Essentially, what we do is we review your application info sheet, your threshold criteria, and then your narrative. Because we don't see the SAM.gov kind of side of things, we can't really help you with, and we can't help you with the application portion of it, but we can review those documents to make sure you're in good shape. But if you just submit on that portal, we have about depending on how many applications are in, a couple day to a week turnaround time, with the last date being January 23rd for first time submissions.
Great. Thank you. Kaylin.
Okay, so yes, very similar. We request that you send us a Word document. Please send it to tab@njit.edu. We will use track changes and comment feature in Word to provide some feedback. And yes, as you can see right now, Santa or NJIT tab's grant review list has some space on it. Please, we are requesting no later than January 14th. That's 2 weeks before the deadline, of course. So we want to give you plenty of time to incorporate our suggestions, maybe go back, do a little more research. I will mention though too, lucky for us, not so much for you, our offices are closed between Christmas and January 2nd. So also try and work that into your timeline. As well as everything else with your grant application. If you're worried about that though, just reach out to us at that email address and we'll discuss timelines with you. We've never turned anyone away yet, so I don't think this year is going to be different. We also have some upcoming events too. These are our virtual grant writing workshops, kind of, similar information to what you heard today, but also diving a little bit more into each of the criterion. So we have a double header tomorrow. We have one on Friday, and we're also looking at January 6th. And then for Region 2 specifically, we're supporting EPA Region 2 January 8th. But all are welcome to any of these if you want some extra tips and pointers.
For Region 3, the Mid-Atlantic region, we can help with grant reviews as well as what we call a grant consultation. You can use that link to schedule a meeting with someone on our team to just walk through the guidelines and answer any of your questions sort of section by section. We can help point you towards some of those data sources that you heard about from us today, and clarify questions about any of the sections, the attachments, or any of those requirements. I also have spent a lot of time in SAM.gov and helping folks navigate their not so helpful help desk. So if you have questions about that, I'm happy to help you with that. But as Randy said, we can't see that and we can't help you actually submit, but I can help you try to navigate their systems. We also have some grant templates for the narrative, the information sheet, the criteria, threshold criteria, and then a budget worksheet. And then our deadline for a guaranteed review return is January 16th, and we would return it by the 23rd. If we get it after that, we'll do our very best to get it back to you, but we can't guarantee. Excuse me. And then we can also support you at a community meeting. So if you're doing a cleanup grant and you feel like you need somebody with you to answer questions from your city council or your county commission, we can be there for that if you get on our calendar ASAP. I know one of my cleanup applicants is here today, and I'll be joining him for his Board of Supervisors meeting. But we're happy to do that if you get it on our calendar soon. And then that's all of our contact information. We also would strongly encourage you to give us grants documents in Word format. It just makes it a lot easier to provide that feedback, and they can all go to that WVU tab at mail.wvu.edu so that we can make sure they get tracked and assigned to the right reviewers. And then that's just our other links to sign up for our newsletter to stay connected.
Great. Thank you. KSU tab reviews, very similar. We prefer to have it in a Microsoft Word format. Like everyone's been saying, it's just a lot easier to provide good feedback and comments. If you could name it, your applicant name, the state, and then the type of grant you will be applying for. Our main focus will be on that narrative criteria, but we will review pretty much anything you send us. So the application information sheet, threshold criteria, if you're applying for cleanup and you have maybe a draft ABCA or your community notification ad that you want a review of just to make sure that you're meeting all of those requirements, you can send it our way. We will review those. If you are a community and you're working with a consultant, or say you're a consultant assisting a community, it's okay for that consultant to communicate with us. However, we do require that the community contact is in the know and included on all correspondence. So that is very important and key, and we won't start a review of anything unless we know that the community has been involved in that request and that communication. Some upcoming events for us are we are holding open office hours, kind of like grant chats, office hours for regions 6, 7, 5, 6, 7, and 8. There's no need to register for these events. You can go onto our website, click on the event, grab a Zoom link, and just during those open times, just pop in. We'll be there to answer any questions that you might have or strategize. And then we also have some designated MARC grant resources that you can access through our webpage.
And hi, everybody. So CCLR's technical assistance services around grant review and grant support are pretty similar to my fellow tabs. We can help you pretty much with everything besides actually writing the grant for you and submitting it. We can help you engage stakeholders and partners like I talked about today. And we can also connect you with grantees with successful applications in the past. So you can look on our website on our resources page for past successful applications. And we, of course, can provide a thorough review of your application. And so you can visit our MAC homepage to learn more, and it's also in a QR code on the next slide. We have tons of resources to help you write your application, and we're also happy to meet with you in a technical assistance meeting, so you can schedule a meeting with us on our website or by scanning that QR code. Definitely join our newsletter for any updates on future events and programs, and please visit our MAC homepage to read the instructions for submitting a draft. They're very similar to my fellow tabs, Word document, include the applicant if you're a consultant, and so on. So definitely please visit all of these pages to learn more and connect with us.
Great. Thank you. And as promised, we want to hear from you. So if you could take a few moments to complete this feedback form on today's event, we would greatly appreciate it. Tell us everything, the good, the bad, the ugly. We value your attendance today, as well as any information you'd be willing to share. We do use the information and feedback to inform future events and education and outreach. So we really would appreciate that. Before we do a final wrap-up closing, are there any final questions in the chat that we need to address?
I don't think so.
Okay. Well, and as a reminder, we did record today's event. We also have been, monitoring the chat. There's some additional links in there. We will create a fact sheet and upload it as a resource to the event webpage. For those that did attend, you will be receiving, a confirmation email with the link back to the event webpage and all these wonderful resources. So thank you all for attending today. And we look forward to, reviewing your applications, seeing your projects, and learning about your community. So thanks.